Marketer of the Day, episode 545. Become the best podcast host you can be. Get out of your rut, deliver aha moments, and create better story-driven content with podcast talent coach David Farough.
Hey everyone, and welcome back to the Marketer of the Day podcast. We're talking with David Farough, and that's spelled Farough. And David is a talent coach. He's a talent coach for podcasters and radio personalities all across the US and Canada. And Dave helps hosts create more appealing content to grow larger audiences and make more money. So Dave, glad to be talking to you.
Thank you so much for having me on your podcast, Robert. And I love your energy and enthusiasm. You sound great.
Awesome. I'm glad to hear it. And just to give everyone a little bit of a background, David reached out via a cold email to me and said that he helps podcast hosts basically be better and be like do some of these amazing things, right? Be more energetic. And I was really curious about just what David had to say, keeping in mind that we can all kind of hear about what what David tells me, so we can all learn a few things. And also the one thing that really kind of piqued my curiosity here, David, is that your advice to me was to not be so long-winded, right? Not be so much on the rambling, and that's totally okay, and I can totally relate, and I have a thick skin. I'm always open to advice, and so I kind of want to start with that, if it's okay, to unpack that a little bit, because me personally, I don't like listening to the podcasts where there are just the short, pre-planned questions, but I understand that, that might not be the majority, so what are your thoughts on that?
Well, here's the challenge, Robert, and the good news is you don't suffer from this alone. A lot of podcasters have this issue, and it's not that it is kind of that they meander. The problem is this. People in your audience have a very short attention span these days. They'll listen for 10, 15, 20 seconds, but if you're not getting to the point very quickly, their mind starts to wander. And they start thinking about all of the other things that they've got to get done today. Oh, I got to pick up my dry cleaning. My kids are out of school at 3. I got to go get them. Oh, my boss wants this report done. They want this. That's what happens inside their head if you take too long to get to the point. Their mind starts to meander and they stop listening, and then they decide, well, maybe I'll hit pause and I'll come back to this later. So to keep the audience engaged, you've got to get to the point quickly. That's the key.
And that makes perfect sense to me, especially in this day and age of the mobile apps and the Facebook sort of stuff. And so how do we know if we're in meandering land? I mean, I know you said there's like that 15, 20 seconds, but how do we just know if we're in meandering land or if we're just playing it fast and loose and having a real conversation?
Well, it's an interesting question, but you have to have a roadmap. And sometimes I use this analogy. Rarely would you get in your car and take a long road trip without having some kind of map or some kind of plan of how you're going to get from A to B. Most people don't just jump in the car and start driving aimlessly all over the place until they eventually get to their destination. You've got to have a plan, okay? And then do your best to stick to that plan without meandering all over the place. And most of the time when you have a conversation, especially if you're interviewing somebody, you'll know when it's time to ask the next question, or you'll know when it's time to stop answering the question. You kind of have that internal head clock, I think. Most people do anyway. And it's much like being at a party on a Saturday night when you're having a conversation with somebody. You can kind of sense when it's time to move things along, and that comes through experience. That comes from just doing a whole lot of interviews to get that inner clock in your head.
Right. I love it. So what you're saying is when we ask a question, maybe have the question already ready to go or know what we're asking as we begin talking, so that way we're not just talking and hoping that, okay, I'm hoping that by the time I finish saying the sentence, I'll know where it's going to end.
Right. You have to have a roadmap. You have to know the point. So if you're doing an interview, you have to know the point of what you're trying to get at, right? And too many times I hear in interviews questions that go like this. So, Dave, I understand you're a talent coach and you work with podcasters, and you do 30-minute sessions with them once a week, and you work on a whole bunch of aspects of their podcasting, and you talk about the fact that people tend to meander too much. So one of your pieces of advice, Dave, is to make sure that you have a roadmap so that you don't meander and you get from A to B. Is all of that right? That's the way a lot of people ask questions in an interview. It doesn't leave me with much to say as the person being interviewed, other than, yes, you're right. Very often interviewers answer the question in the way that they ask the question, which is meandering and way too long. Are you following me?
I think I am. What I'm hearing is that maybe the questions are a little too softball. It's like it's one thing to tee up a question for someone, but when you're asking them and answering the question so that the only thing you can really say is, yeah, sure, then how does that really help anyone? That seems sort of hard to follow.
Right. You have to answer or ask open-minded questions, or open-ended questions is the key, right? Give them an opportunity to tell a story. Get to the point as quickly as you can with your question, and then listen to the answer.
I love it. Open-ended questions. So this is starting to make sense to me as far as what you do. We got a little bit of a taste here as far as the problems that you see with podcasters and what you do. So here's an open-ended question for you. When you see or you listen to podcast hosts out there, do you see like a bunch of common problems across the board? Is there like a number one or a top two or three just glaring issues that you see us podcast hosts having?
Yeah. The biggest one is probably not getting to the key points fast enough. A good podcast starts with action right off the top. Are you a James Bond fan by any chance?
I wouldn't say I'm a huge fan, but I'll watch a James Bond, and I love how they start off with the opening gamut, which they jump right into the action first 5 minutes.
Yeah, man. In the first 30 seconds, there's action. Right? Something blows up. Somebody dies. Something's happening that grabs you by the ears and pulls you right in. You've got to get to the action quickly to grab the attention of the audience. And too often I hear a produced introduction that goes 15 or 20 seconds, and then there's a long setup by the host about what this episode's going to be about. Today we're going to learn this and this and this and this and this and this, and that sometimes goes for 2 or 3 minutes. And then they get to the guest, and then there's a whole bunch of bio about the guest and who they are, and then finally they get to a key point about 10 or 15 minutes into the podcast. That's too long. Start the podcast with a key point. Welcome to the podcast. Here's what you're going to learn today. Here's one takeaway. It's going to better your life. You're going to be a better person because you're going to learn this. Get right to the point, tease them on what they're going to learn, and then get into the recorded intro and the bio and all of that stuff. So start strong. That's one of the best things that you can do.
I love it, and I can relate to that as a listener, where some of these podcasts will have two sponsors at the top of the show, and they treat it almost like a talk show where they're like, I'm going to have my 10-minute monologue, and I'm thinking, I just listened here for the guests. So I love this. Right. You're saying have that hook, have that takeaway. That way we can just jump right into the action. And you're also making me think back to before the days of podcasting, I'd listen to different marketing interviews, and they would take a clip of somewhere in the middle of the interview, like the juiciest part, and put it in the front as a little bit of a teaser so we can say, well, here's something we're going to get here right here off the bat. And so all of this makes sense. And so what this opens up for me next is that I guess the opposite of that I see sometimes is some of these podcast hosts will have maybe even too much of a format. And what I mean by that is they'll ask the guest about their life story. They'll ask, well, why'd you get started? Give me the history. And do you think that's okay? Because I just know as a podcast listener, starting with the guest's life story and their origin, it gets a little boring or repetitive for me. So what do you think?
Well, exactly. If they've got an interesting history, if they've got an interesting background, if they've done something that really stands out to you in their bio that you find very interesting, chances are your audience will too. And I will start there. I would start there with your guest. I wouldn't do a long introduction about who your guest is. If I was doing a podcast, I would say, today, Robert joins me on the podcast. Robert, what are one or two things the audience needs to know about you?
Awesome. I love it.
And let them do it. Let them bring up one or two key points that are important to them. They'll know what they want the audience to know. So put it on their shoulders instead of you having to read lines and lines on that prepared bio that they sent you.
And I've noticed that too, when there's a long bio. I mean, I'm the kind of guy where I like to read the whole bio, but if it's too long, I find myself skipping to the last paragraph or just, wrapping it and cutting it short so that way it's only 30 seconds or so at the max. So Along those lines, are there one or two key points that are important to you that you feel like we need to know about?
Oh, that's a good question. I guess, people sometimes ask me when I'm doing an introductory call and they're asking me about my services. They say, well, what's your background? What makes you so good at coaching talent? And I guess I would say it comes from experience. I have been involved in radio broadcasting and the media for over 30 years now. I was on the radio myself, hosting shows for many, many years. And then I went behind the scenes working with talent. So I would sit with broadcasters on a daily basis and help them understand the target audience better. Help them understand who they're talking to and what are the things those people care about. And once we have a strong understanding of the target audience, then we can create content that we know they're going to like. So I help them create the content. I help them use their voice effectively so that they sound energetic and enthusiastic and they tell a good story. I make sure that they understand how to get from A to B and all of these other tips and tricks. And I've been doing it for years and years and years. I've worked with personalities in small markets as well as some of the biggest markets across North America. So through experience, I found out what works. And, I find that most of my clients find the calls pretty inspiring. And by the time the sessions are over, they want to, get into the studio and do their best podcasts.
Well, great. And that nugget buried in there, that concept of what's in it for me, that is one of the most basic marketing concepts. But at the same time, I forget it over and over again, and I have to be reminded of it. And what I mean by that is I am a computer programmer, and when I first got started with this, I'm 33 years young now. When I got started, I was 17 or so, and I would just make fun little software programs, little doodads, but no one wanted them. They were fun for me to make, but how does that make money? And then likewise, I was listening to a course the other day about how to write a good book. And the beginning chunk of it was all about don't just write a book for the heck of it, but go out there and do your research and figure out what the market wants and then provide it to them. And then that's what I'm hearing from you here as far as your content and your style and your energy and all that sort of stuff that us podcast hosts need to keep in mind is look at what people want and then give it to them. And so you've been, go ahead if you have something to add on there.
It goes back to understanding your audience. And when your audience finds your podcast, whether it's on iTunes or Podbean or Stitcher or Lisbon or wherever they search for their podcasts, before they hit play, they're thinking this: what's in it for me? WIIFM. What's in it for me? So you better give them something as a payoff for the time they're about to invest in your podcast. Make sure they're getting something for the experience. So whether it's something they're going to learn or some kind of an emotional response, and the only way you can create content that's going to do that is by knowing the audience. Know their likes, their dislikes, what their fears are, and build content around that to keep them interested.
And when I have different service providers, coaches like yourself in all different areas who come and explain what they do, a common thread I'm hearing from them and what you're reminding me of here also is that it sometimes helps to get that outside perspective, to have someone who isn't so close to your business, to see what it's like on the outside. As you said, that when they discover your podcast on whatever platform and they go and they click play and they only have that attention span for a certain amount of time, that we can't always tell what those likes and dislikes are unless we have someone from the outside looking in. So you've mentioned a few times here about your introductory call, and I'm curious about what that process is like. And I guess where does it sort of start? Because I'm sure that some people might be saying, well, I want to be a better podcast host or a better speaker, and I want to hop on one of these calls, but is he going to make fun of my podcast artwork? No. Is he going to tell me to change things? Like, what's this introductory call like?
Every podcast has things that the person is doing very, very well. We always start with a positive. That's part of the process. So the introductory call talks about things you're doing well. And then each call after that, as we get into the sessions, we always start with a positive. Let's celebrate the good things that are going on with your podcast. And then each week we'll pick out one or two things that you can work on. And the following week, if you fix those things, then we move on to something else. If you haven't, then we continue to work on them. But these sessions are very, very positive. And the introductory call is all about, what are your goals of the podcast? Why do you do a podcast? What do you love about podcasting? What are some of the things that you think you do really well? And what are some of the things you're having a challenge with? So we talk all about that in the introductory call. And then we talk about, how my sessions work, fees, all of that kind of thing. And then if they decide to go ahead, then we do. But it's really about, and then the first session is about the target audience. So who is it, when you close your eyes, Robert, and you're doing the podcast, who is it that you imagine in your mind's eye? Who is your target audience? We spend a lot of time talking about that.
And that question right there about when I close my eyes, who do I imagine? That's something that I hadn't even thought about until a couple of hundred episodes in the podcast. And I realized after doing a few of these that it turned out that a lot of people listening were people who don't scale enough, who don't believe in themselves enough, who need to break out of their shell and grow a bigger business. And now that I sort of know who I'm targeting with that, now I can ask those better questions or have a smoother transaction when it comes to those guests. And I wish that I had someone to have me think about those important questions early.
Yeah, and here's the most important question of all when you think about your target audience. What keeps them awake at 3 o'clock in the morning? What are their fears? What do they worry about? If you can figure that out, then it becomes so easy to build content that they're going to be highly interested in and they're going to find high value in.
Right, and I imagine that this allows you to tap into their caveman brain. Who wants to be intellectual? It's more fun to be emotional and tap into those fears and frustrations as opposed to just coming up with something or being academic. And so when you have this introductory call and you're asking some of these questions about like your goals, your challenges, what do you love, why do you do it, does anything come to mind as far as the common answers? Like, is there a top answer as far as some of these questions, as far as what people say in response?
Well, the response that I love to hear is, I podcast because I love it. I love telling stories. I love talking to people. I love learning new things. I love that answer. It worries me when people say, I do a podcast because I want to make a ton of money. I think you're starting in the wrong space. I mean, we all want to make money. We all want to be able to monetize the podcast. We all want to cover our hard costs. But if your end goal is to make a lot of money, I'm not sure that's the right incentive. I want you to do it because you love to create audio. You love to tell stories because it's hard work putting together a podcast on a regular basis, right?
For sure.
So you've got to do it because you love it. That's the answer I love to hear.
And I'll be honest with you, is that it sometimes takes me, I guess it took me a while to tap into that love of podcasting. I think at first, I admit I did get into it for the wrong reasons. And sometimes when I'd see that calendar notification come up and it was time to give someone a phone call, I'd think, I guess I'll do it. And when it began ringing, I think in the back of my head, I almost sort of hope they don't pick up so that way I don't have to do this. And I don't know what happened or what changed. Maybe it was just doing enough of these or having decent guests or seeing the positive in it or something. But somehow something changed in me where now I tapped into doing the podcasting for the love of it and the enjoyment and making the connections and learning stuff.
Yeah, well, you probably got some positive feedback. I'm sure you've grown an audience over time, and the audience gives you positive feedback, and that's nice to hear. It's nice to hear that you're making a difference in people's lives and that you're entertaining them with your podcast. And that motivates a lot of people to continue to podcast because you're entertaining them.
And I think that's it exactly. I think that at first it was a little rough. I had trouble feeling people out. I would sometimes ask the long questions and get really short answers from people. And I think a big breakthrough for me was just figuring out what's someone's pace, what's someone's length. Are they answering me in 30-second sound bites, or are they answering me in like more long-winded 5-minute things? And I think once I figured that out, things became smoother. And you're just now making me realize also that the feedback really helped, that seeing people like the tweets and retweet things helped. And then I'd sometimes get little unsolicited emails from people saying, well, I listened to your podcast with this person and then I bought his book. Or I'd sometimes get thank you cards in the mail, or someone sent me this really fancy water bottle and a huge handwritten postcard. It was filled up with both sides saying, thanks so much, I love it so much. And you're making me realize that just that connection with the people, not only with the guests sometimes, but also with people saying, I bought their book or I bought their course. I mean, that's what did it for me.
Absolutely. Keep in mind, Robert, when you're interviewing people, that the best interview question you can ask is this one. Why? That's the best interview question ever. Why did you write that book? Why did you start that company? Why do you think you became so successful? Why is a great question because it demands that they tell a story.
Awesome. I love it.
And it's nice and short, and it's easy to understand. Why did you do that? Best question ever.
So why did you do that? When we're talking about you being a podcast talent coach, why is it podcasting specifically? Why isn't it just more generalized and speakers, things like that?
Well, as I said earlier, I was in the radio industry. I still am in the radio industry, but the radio industry is changing. It's got its challenges. It's advertiser driven. So, advertiser revenues are falling. Radio stations are having challenging times. I wouldn't say radio's in decline, but I'd say they've got a lot of challenges ahead of them and a lot of things to figure out, whereas podcasting is growing. It's got such momentum. I mean, every week in the U.S., there's thousands of podcasts done. I think, at the latest count, there was about 350 or 400,000 podcast episodes available to listen to. Everybody's into it, and it's an exciting space. I go to conferences or I talk to people, and they're so excited about podcasting. So I thought, there's a real opportunity to help people get better at what they like to do. A lot of people that do podcasts, most of the people that do podcasts, have no broadcast experience. They went out and bought a microphone and they've downloaded some software, and now they're thinking, now what? What do I do? So if I can work with these people on a regular basis and help them understand how to create better content, how to tell better stories, how to use their voice more effectively so that they can grow bigger audiences, I love that. I love helping people get better at what they do.
Well, it's very inspiring. Why stick with that struggling industry? Why be hanging on to stuff and be dealing with scarcity when you can go to what's growing, what's exciting, what brings you abundance? And I can definitely relate to that. I'm definitely with you there, where when I go to networking events, conferences, things like that, people ask about what I do, and maybe sometimes I'll say I'm a programmer, or I create software, or I create courses, and then I have a podcast, and then suddenly they light up, and then I can change the conversation into, well, what do you do? And do you want to hop on my podcast and talk about what it is you do? And suddenly the conversation is about them. So it's a great networking tool as well. But it seems like that this whole concept of podcasting seems to be super exciting these days, just because it's new, it's easy, it's what people are interested in these days, and it's about people, not just about the boring stuff. So you mentioned that you do this this introductory call, and then you meet again over time to work on a few issues here and there. So what's the pricing like? I know with the coach that's a little bit of a loaded question, because like you change your rates and different things for different people, but how much can people expect to pay to beef up these podcasting skills of theirs?
Well, it's a great question. I know that many people are on a budget. I know budgets are tight, because a lot of podcasts are done by people who have other jobs other than just podcasting, and they use their podcast as a way to market other aspects of their careers. So budgets are tight in many ways, and I keep that in mind with my pricing. So just back to the process, we do a 30-minute session every week. I like to do them at the same day and time every week so that we can lock them into our calendars and we know they're coming. There's two structures when it comes to pricing. You can go on a pay-as-you-go basis. Each session on a pay-as-you-go basis is $125 Canadian. It's a 30-minute session. And following the session, I take very detailed notes and I fire them off to you so that you have them in your inbox within 15 or 20 minutes of the call. And I also add you to a list, and I send out research on a regular basis that I see, different articles, different blogs that I aggregate from sources around the world, things that I think you'd find interesting in the podcast space. So it's a 30-minute session plus the notes, plus the bonus of those blogs. It's $125 per session. That's Canadian dollars, by the way. So if you're listening to this in the US, there's an automatic 25% off with the exchange rate. Or you can buy bulk sessions. You can buy 4 at a time. And if you buy 4 sessions at a time, there's a little bit of a discount. I do those sessions at $100 each.
Super cool. And so, was there more?
No, that's it. The only thing about buying in bulk, they're non-cancelable, meaning if you have to cancel for whatever reason, they're non-refundable.
Okay, fair enough. I would expect nothing less. And that right there, where you explain your pricing, that taps into something that I think it was a mental block for a long time, up until maybe the past 12 months or so. And it's that I used to resist hiring a coach because I thought, well, I'm going to be locked into this monthly thing. It's going to be in my monthly budget. But then I realized I'm an idiot. Anyone I get coaching from, including you, I can just hire them for 1 or 2 sessions, and it doesn't have to be this ongoing commitment.
Right. And what I found with my clients is most of them hang in for about 6 months. We start with some very basic things. We build a strong foundation. They grow and grow and grow. And after about 6 months, they take a break. Some of them come back. Some of them don't, but that's okay too. As long as I've helped them grow and they feel that they've got a real benefit. What happens in most cases, as I explained earlier, was that people just find the calls inspiring. Sometimes they get into a bit of a rut and they're not quite sure, how to get to the next level, how to improve the podcast. So each week I give them just little tips, and there's that aha moment. And they go, oh, okay, I'm going to try that. And they can't wait to get back into the studio and try something. So they find the sessions are actually inspiring and kind of give them a bit of a kick in the butt to go and produce better content.
Fantastic. Well, it's time for all of us to get that kick in the butt and level up. So I want to make sure that as we're closing up this call here, that everyone knows where the heck they can reach out to you, hire you, talk to you, maybe even get you to convince them to hire you for some of this coaching. So can you drop some links here and tell us where we all should go after hearing this conversation today? Yeah,
it's really simple. My website is beabetterpodcaster.ca. beabetterpodcaster.ca. On there, you'll find everything about the process, my history. There's a contact form there. There's various resources, a bunch of research up there that you can download for free. There's there's client testimonials on there so you can see what people are saying about the services. And please reach out. Let's do an introductory call. I'd love to learn more about your podcast, why you do it, all of those good things. And maybe I can help take you to the next level.
Well, great. Well, you guys heard it. That's the place to go, beabetterpodcaster.ca, and reach out to David. There's no harm in bouncing off some ideas on him, telling him what you're all about, telling them what your challenges, fears, frustrations are. So go ahead, do it right now, beabetterpodcaster.com, and reach out to David and tell him what you're up to with your podcast, so that way he can help you get to where you need to go. So beabetterpodcaster.ca, and thanks so much, David, for setting us straight on what we need to know as podcast hosts and what we need to know to be better.
It is my pleasure, Robert, and best of luck with your podcast. You're doing a great job.
Awesome. Thank you. Check out the latest episodes of our podcast on the web at marketeroftheday.com and subscribe to us on iTunes at marketeroftheday.com/iTunes, or search the phrase Robert Plank in your iTunes app to find us there.